The scissors felt heavier than they should have in Margaret Hartwell's weathered hands. Each snip echoed through the empty grain silo like a gunshot, metallic and final. Isabella Martinez sat motionless on the overturned milk crate, her 3-month-old daughter Sophie pressed against her chest, both of them shivering in the December wind that whistled through the rusted metal walls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You think pretty hair makes you special? Margaret's voice, cut sharper than the blades. Think it makes people forget what you really are? Isabella's dark waves fell in clumps around her feet, each strand carrying away another piece of the woman she used to be. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's tension, tiny fingers clutching at Isabella's torn sweater. Isabella wanted to speak, wanted to beg, wanted to explain that she'd tried so hard to be the daughter-in-law Margaret wanted. But the words had dried up somewhere between the funeral and this moment, between losing David in that construction accident and watching his mother's grief transform into something cold and calculating. Margaret circled her like a predator, scissors glinting in the weak afternoon light filtering through holes in the silo roof. David's dead because of you. If he hadn't been working double shifts to pay for your medical bills, your fancy baby formula, that's not true. The words slipped out before Isabella could stop them. The scissors paused mid-cut. Margaret's pale blue eyes, so much like David's but empty of his warmth, fixed on Isabella's face. What did you say? Isabella's throat constricted. She'd learned not to speak, not to defend herself, not to give Margaret any reason to escalate. But holding Sophie, feeling her daughter's heartbeat against her own, something desperate stirred. In her chest, David wanted to work. He was saving for Sophie's college fund. Margaret's laugh was bitter as the winter wind. College fund, for her. She gestured dismissively at the baby. Everyone knows she's not David's. Look at her hair, those dark eyes. My son was blonde and blue-eyed like his father. The accusation hit Isabella like a physical blow. It wasn't true Sophie was David's daughter, born with Isabella's coloring but David's stubborn chin and gentle hands. But Margaret had been planting these seeds since Sophie's birth, whispering to neighbors, showing old photos of David as a baby, pointing out every difference. She is his daughter, Isabella whispered, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. Is she? Margaret grabbed a handful of Isabella's remaining hair and yanked her head back. Because I've been thinking about that timeline, girl. About when you said you got pregnant. About how David was away on that job site in Oregon for 3 weeks right around then. Isabella's scalp burned where Margaret pulled, but the pain in her chest was worse. David had been in Oregon, but he'd driven home 2 weekends during that time. They'd been trying for a baby, planning their future. But Margaret twisted everything, made love look like lies, made hope look like deception. Please, Isabella managed, just let us go. I'll leave town. You'll never see us again. Margaret released her hair with a shove that nearly sent Isabella tumbling off the crate. Only her desperate grip on Sophie kept them both upright. Oh, you're leaving all right. But not with her. The words hung in the frigid air like ice crystals. Isabella's blood went cold. What do you mean? I mean I've been talking to lawyers about grandparents' rights, about unfit mothers. Margaret resumed cutting, each snip more violent than the last. About young women who can't even keep a roof over their heads, who've been living off charity since their husbands died. It was true, and it wasn't. Isabella had been staying in Margaret's spare room since David's death 3 months ago, paying what little she could from her part-time job at the diner. Margaret had insisted it was temporary, just until Isabella got back on her feet. But every day had brought new rules, new restrictions, new ways to make Isabella feel like a burden. I'm working. I'm saving money for an apartment. Minimum wage at Mel's diner? Margaret's voice dripped with disdain. You think that impresses a judge? You think they care about your little savings account with its $47? Isabella's stomach dropped. How did Margaret know exactly how much she had saved? Had she been going through Isabella's things? The lawyer says it's an open and shut case, Margaret continued, circling back to stand in front of Isabella. Young mother, no family support, no stable income, no permanent address. And then there's the question of paternity. I told you. You told me a lot of things. Margaret's voice turned silky, dangerous. But blood tests don't lie. And if it turns out that baby isn't David's, she shrugged. Well, then you've got no claim to Hartwell family support at all, do you? The silo seemed to spin around Isabella. Margaret couldn't force a paternity test, could she? But even the suggestion, the doubt, would be enough to poison any custody hearing. Small towns loved gossip, and Margaret had been feeding them a steady diet of speculation about Isabella's character. Why are you doing this? Isabella's voice cracked. I loved David. I love Sophie. I never asked for anything from you. Because you don't belong here. Margaret grabbed the last long section of Isabella's hair and hacked it off close to her. Scalp, you never did. My David was going places before he met you. College scholarship, good prospects. Then you got your hooks in him with that pretty face and those tears about your sick mother. Isabella remembered those days differently. She'd been working 2 jobs to pay for her mother's cancer treatments when she met David at the hardware store where she cleaned offices. He'd been kind, patient, offering to help carry supplies to her car. They'd talked for hours on their first date, sharing dreams about travel and family and building something beautiful together. He'd proposed after her mother died, saying he wanted to be her family now, but Margaret saw it as theft. Every moment of David's happiness with Isabella was something stolen from her. He was mine first, Margaret whispered, her face close enough that Isabella could smell the whiskey on her breath. My baby boy, and you took him away from me. The baby started crying, a thin wail that echoed off the metal walls. Isabella tried to rock her, to soothe her, but Sophie seemed to sense the danger they were in. Her cries grew louder, more desperate. Shut her up, Margaret snapped. She's hungry. It's past her feeding time. Then you should have thought of that before you decided to run your mouth. Margaret stepped back, surveying her handiwork. Isabella's hair now hung in jagged, uneven chunks. Some pieces barely an inch long, others missed entirely. She looked like she'd been attacked, which she supposed she had been. There, Margaret said with satisfaction. Now you look like what you are, white trash. Isabella's free hand flew to her head, fingers exploring the devastation. She'd always been proud of her hair, one of the few things about herself she'd never doubted. David used to run his fingers through it, call it silk and midnight. Now it felt like rough stubble under her palm. Please, she tried one more time, just let me take Sophie and go. You'll never have to see us again. Margaret walked to the corner of the silo where she'd left a canvas bag. She pulled out a thin blanket, threadbare and smelling of mothballs, and threw it at Isabella's feet. You want to go? Fine, there's the door. Isabella looked toward the silo entrance where snow had been falling steadily for the past hour. The forecast had called for a blizzard, temperatures dropping to dangerous lows. In this weather, with a baby? Not my problem anymore. Margaret pulled on her heavy coat, her warm gloves, her insulated boots. You made your choice when you decided to disrespect me. When you decide to keep running your mouth about things that aren't your business. Margaret, please, she's just a baby. She's innocent in all this. Is she David's baby? The question hung between them like a trap. Isabella knew that anything she said would be wrong. If she insisted Sophie was David's, Margaret would demand proof Isabella couldn't provide. If she stayed silent, Margaret would take that as confirmation of her suspicions. I loved your son, Isabella said finally. And this is his daughter, Margaret's expression didn't change. Then you won't mind proving it in court. After you figure out where you're going to sleep tonight. She turned and walked toward the entrance, her boots crunching on the scattered hay and debris. Isabella scrambled to her feet, still clutching Sophie, the thin blanket trailing behind her. Wait, please. At least let me get our things from the house. Sophie's formula, her clothes. Margaret paused at the entrance, snow swirling around. Her? What things? The clothes I bought? The formula I paid for? The house that belongs to me? She shook her head. You came here with nothing, girl. That's exactly what you're leaving with. The diaper bag, please, just her supplies. Should have thought of that before you decided to bite the hand that feeds you. Margaret stepped out into the storm. Good luck, Isabella. I hope you find somewhere warm to spend the night. The silo. Doors slammed shut with a clang that seemed to echo forever. Isabella heard the scrape of metal on metal as Margaret dragged something heavy across the entrance. A beam, maybe, or a piece of farming equipment. Something to make sure Isabella couldn't follow her out the way she'd come in. Isabella ran to the door and pushed, but it held firm. She could hear Margaret's footsteps growing fainter, the sound of a car engine starting, tires crunching on snow as she drove away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella sank to her knees, Sophie still crying. In her arms, the baby's face was red with cold and hunger, her tiny body shaking beneath the thin onesie and sleeper that were all she wore. Isabella pulled the moth-eaten blanket around them both, but it provided little warmth against the wind pouring through the gaps in the silo walls. She looked around desperately, searching for another way out. The silo was old, probably built in the 1940s, its metal walls pitted with rust and age. There were gaps where the wind whistled through, but none large enough for a person to squeeze through. The only other opening was a loading chute about 20 feet up, accessible only by a rusted ladder that looked like it would collapse if she breathed on it wrong. Even if she could climb it while carrying Sophie, even if the ladder held, the chute opened onto the silo's exterior wall. She'd be jumping down into a snowdrift with no idea how deep it was or what lay beneath it. Sophie's grew weaker, more exhausted. Isabella tried to nurse her, but her milk supply had been dropping from stress and poor nutrition. Margaret had been controlling their food, doling out small portions and commenting on every bite Isabella took. "Baby, wait," she'd say with disgust. David always liked his women to take care of themselves. Now Sophie latched on desperately but found little comfort. Isabella felt the familiar ache of inadequacy, the fear that she wasn't enough for her daughter. Maybe Margaret was right about everything. The temperature was dropping fast. Isabella could see her breath misting in the air, could feel the cold seeping through the concrete floor into her bones. Sophie had stopped crying altogether, which was somehow worse than the wailing. Babies who got too cold became lethargic, Isabella knew. Their bodies shut down to conserve energy. She stood and began walking around the perimeter of the silo, looking for anything that might help. Old farming equipment lined the walls, a broken plow, some rotted grain bags, a pile of rusted tools. In one corner, she found a few pieces of old lumber and some torn canvas that might have once been a tarp. Working with one hand while keeping Sophie pressed against her chest, Isabella dragged the lumber into the center of the silo and tried to build a windbreak. The wood was heavy and awkward, and several times she nearly dropped the baby while wrestling with a stubborn board. But gradually, she managed to create a small shelter, 3 walls of lumber with the canvas stretched across the top. It wasn't much, but it blocked some of the wind. She crawled inside with Sophie and wrapped them both in the blanket, their shared body heat creating a small pocket of relative warmth. Sophie's breathing was shallow but steady. Isabella pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and felt the soft flutter of her pulse. Still alive. Still fighting. Outside, the wind howled like something wild and angry. Snow blew through the gaps in the silo walls, creating small drifts. In the corners, Isabella could hear the storm intensifying, the kind of blizzard that would shut down roads and keep everyone indoors for days. No one would come looking for them. Margaret would tell people that Isabella had left town, run off in the night like the irresponsible girl she'd always claimed she was. By the time anyone thought to question the story, if they ever did, it would be too late. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to think. The silo was on Margaret's property, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. Even if she could somehow get out, she'd never make it through the storm on foot with a baby. The snow was already knee-deep and rising. She thought about David, about the plans they'd made for their life together. They'd talked about buying a small house with a garden where Isabella could grow vegetables and flowers. David had wanted to teach Sophie to fish in the creek behind his friend's property, to show her how to identify bird calls and track deer through the woods. Now David was gone, buried in the same cemetery where his father lay, and Sophie might never see her first birthday. Isabella felt something break inside her chest, some last reserve of strength or hope finally cracking under the pressure. She'd tried so hard to be strong, to prove she was worthy of David's love and capable of raising his daughter. But maybe Margaret was right. Maybe she was nothing but trouble, a burden, a mistake that had cost too much. Sophie stirred against her chest, making the small mewing sounds that meant she was dreaming. Even in sleep, even in the cold, she clung to her mother with tiny fists. Trusting, depending, believing that Isabella would keep her safe. Isabella pressed her face into Sophie's soft hair and made a promise. She might not be able to save herself, but she would fight for her daughter until her last breath. Sophie deserved better than this, better than a mother who couldn't provide, better than a grandmother who saw her as a burden, better than dying in a frozen silo because adults couldn't stop hurting each other. But she would fight, even if it was hopeless, even if no one was coming, even if the storm raged all night and buried them both beneath the snow. She would fight. The first hour passed in a haze of denial. Isabella kept expecting to hear Margaret's car returning, the scrape of the beam being moved away from the door, her mother-in-law's voice calling out that this had all been a cruel lesson, but now it was over. "Come inside," she would say. "We'll talk about this like civilized people." But the only sounds were wind and the steady percussion of snow hitting metal, each flake adding weight to the storm that was rapidly becoming something deadly. Sophie had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her tiny body limp against Isabella's chest. Her breathing came in quick, shallow puffs that created barely visible clouds in the frigid air. Isabella adjusted the thin blanket constantly, trying to cover every inch of exposed skin. But the cold seemed to seep through everything. Isabella's own body was shutting down in stages. First her fingers and toes went numb, then her hands and feet. She flexed them constantly, working circulation back into her extremities, but each time it took longer, required more effort. Her scalp burned where Margaret had hacked away her hair, the exposed skin sensitive to every draft. She tried to calculate how long they could survive. 3 hours? 6? She'd read somewhere that hypothermia could set in within minutes in a severe cold, especially for babies. Sophie's onesie and sleeper were cotton, designed for indoor comfort, not survival. They might as well have been tissue. Paper, the makeshift shelter she'd built, provided some relief from the direct wind, but cold radiated up from the concrete floor like it was made of ice. Isabella sat cross-legged with Sophie in her lap, the blanket wrapped around both of them, and felt the cold claiming her body inch by inch. By the second hour, Sophie began making sounds that terrified Isabella. Not crying would have been normal, healthy even. These were small, weak mewling noises like a kitten that had lost its mother. When Isabella tried to rouse her, Sophie's responses were sluggish. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. That made Isabella's heart race with panic. "Stay with me," Isabella whispered, rubbing Sophie's back through the blanket. "Please, baby girl, stay with me." She tried nursing again, desperate to get some warmth and calories into her daughter. But Sophie barely had the energy to latch on. When she did manage to nurse, it was weak and brief, as if the effort exhausted her. Isabella found herself making bargains with God, with the universe, with anyone who might be listening. "Take me instead. Let her live, and I'll accept whatever happens. I'll sign any papers Margaret wants. I'll disappear and never claim to be David's wife. Just let my baby survive this." The wind picked up as the evening deepened, howling through the silo like a living thing. Snow began accumulating in the corners despite the closed door, finding its way through gaps and cracks Isabella hadn't even noticed. Soon there were small drifts forming against the interior walls. She had to keep moving. Sitting still meant giving in to the cold, letting it claim her. But every movement risked disturbing Sophie, and her daughter needed whatever rest she could get. Isabella compromised by shifting positions frequently, standing every 15 minutes to pace the small confines of their shelter, doing whatever exercises she could manage while holding a baby. During one of these movement sessions, Isabella noticed something that made her stomach drop. Sophie's diaper was dry. Completely dry. Baby Sophie's age typically needed changing every few hours, but there had been nothing since they'd been trapped in the silo. It meant Sophie was becoming dehydrated, her little body conserving every bit of moisture it could. Isabella tried to give Sophie drops of melted snow, holding tiny bits of ice in her mouth until they liquefied, then transferring the water drop by drop to her daughter's lips. But Sophie was too weak to swallow properly, and most of the water dribbled down her chin. The reality of their situation crystallized with brutal clarity. They were going to die here. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Sophie first, because babies couldn't regulate their body temperature the way adults could. Then Isabella, probably sometime tomorrow when the cold finally overwhelmed her body's ability to generate heat. Sophie made a small sound, barely more than a sigh, and Isabella looked down at her daughter with fresh panic. In the gray morning light filtering through the walls, Sophie's skin looked almost translucent, her lips tinged with blue. Her breathing was so shallow that Isabella had to watch closely to detect any movement at all. They were running out of time. Whatever was happening outside, whoever was coming, it might be their last chance. The engine shut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Isabella could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then came the slam of a truck door, followed by footsteps crunching through snow. Heavy boots, moving with purpose but not haste. Someone who knew how to navigate winter terrain, who wasn't struggling against the elements. Isabella tried to call out but discovered her voice had been reduced to a whisper by the cold and dehydration. She swallowed painfully, gathering what little saliva she could manage, and tried again. "Help," she croaked, the word barely audible even to herself. "Please help us." The footsteps paused. Isabella held her breath, straining to hear any indication that her weak plea had been detected. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the steps resumed, but now they were moving differently, more deliberately, with clear direction toward the silo entrance. A man's voice cut through the metal walls. Gruff but not unkind. "Hello, someone in there?" Isabella's relief was so intense it made her dizzy. "Yes," she managed, louder this time. "We're trapped. Please help us." "Stand back from the door," the voice commanded. "I'm gonna move whatever's blocking it." Isabella heard the scrape of metal on metal as he wrestled with whatever Margaret had used to barricade the entrance. There was a grunt of effort, then the sound of something heavy falling into snow. A pause, then more scraping as he cleared additional obstacles. "This gonna take a minute," he called. "You hurt? Need me to call an ambulance?" "Baby," Isabella whispered, then forced herself to speak louder. "I have a baby. She's not good." The scraping sounds intensified, accompanied by what sounded like creative profanity muttered under his breath. Isabella caught fragments, something about "damn fool" and "what kind of person," but his words were mostly lost in the effort of moving the barriers. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Isabella heard the blessed sound of the door mechanism turning. Light flooded the silo as the entrance swung open, bringing with it a rush of cold air that somehow felt warmer than the trapped atmosphere inside their shelter. The man silhouetted in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a knitted cap pulled low over his eyes. Snow clung to his beard and the shoulders of his jacket, and Isabella could see the vapor of his breath as he stepped inside and surveyed the scene. His gaze found her, immediately a young woman, with butchered hair clutching a bundle of blankets in a makeshift shelter of scrap wood and canvas. For a moment he just stared, and Isabella saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he'd seen this particular kind of cruelty before. "Jesus," he breathed, and there was anger in his voice now. "What the hell happened here?" Isabella tried to stand, but her legs buckled. The man was across the silo in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside her before she could fall completely. Up close, she could see his face weathered and sun-lined, with gray eyes that held an unexpected gentleness despite the fury burning behind them. "Easy there," he said, his voice dropping to a softer register. "Don't try to move too fast." "You've been here all night?" Isabella nodded, unable to trust her voice. The man's attention shifted to the bundle in her arms, and she saw his jaw tighten as he registered that she was holding a baby. "How old?" he asked. 3 months, Isabella managed. He pulled off his gloves and reached toward Sophie with careful hands. "May I?" Isabella hesitated for just a moment. She'd been holding Sophie so tightly for so long that releasing her felt dangerous, but then nodded. The man's fingers were warm as he gently touched Sophie's forehead, then checked her pulse at her tiny wrist. "She's alive," he said, and Isabella could hear the relief in his voice, "but her body temperature's way too low. We need to get you both somewhere warm, fast." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around Isabella and Sophie both, the residual heat from his body immediately noticeable against her frozen skin. The coat smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something indefinable that spoke of safety. "Can you walk?" he asked. Isabella tried to shift her weight and gasped as pain shot through her cramped muscles. "I don't think so. My legs ... That's okay, I got you." Without waiting for permission, he scooped her up, blankets, baby, and all, as if she weighed nothing. Isabella's first instinct was to protest. She was too heavy, too much trouble, but the words died in her throat as she felt human warmth surrounding her for the first time in hours. He carried her out of the silo with surprising grace, navigating the snow and debris without jarring her unnecessarily. Outside, Isabella got her first look at the vehicle that had brought her salvation, a battered pickup truck with a plow blade mounted on the front and chains on the tires. It looked like it had seen better decades, but it had made it through the storm to reach them. The man settled her in the passenger seat, cranking the heat to maximum before turning his attention to Sophie. "Got a thermos of coffee here," he said, producing a large metal container from behind the driver's seat. "It's still warm. Think you can handle some?" Isabella nodded, though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the cup he poured for her. The coffee was black and strong, burning her throat as she swallowed, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. She could feel it spreading warmth through her chest, awakening parts of her body that had gone numb with cold. Man watched her drink with the focused attention of someone assessing a medical emergency. "You got feeling in your fingers and toes?" Isabella flexed experimentally. "Starting to. It hurts." "Good. Pain means no frostbite. He adjusted the vents to direct more warm air toward them. Baby responding to the heat at all? Isabella looked down at Sophie, who was still frighteningly still in her arms. But as the truck's heater worked its magic, she thought she detected a slightly pinker color returning to her daughter's cheeks. I think so. Maybe. The man nodded and put the truck in gear. My place is about 10 minutes from here. Got a wood stove, plenty of blankets, and a phone to call for medical help if we need it. As they pulled away from the silo, Isabella caught sight of the barriers that had trapped them, a heavy steel beam and several pieces of farm equipment, arranged to make opening the door impossible from the inside. It would have taken deliberate effort to position them that way. Someone did this on purpose, the man said, following her gaze. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. This wasn't an accident. Isabella's throat closed up. She couldn't bring herself to explain about Margaret, about the custody threats and the hair cutting, and the accusations about Sophie's parentage. It all seemed too complicated, too sordid to share with this stranger who had saved their lives. Yeah, she whispered, on purpose. The man glanced at her, and she could see him processing the implications. You got somewhere safe to go after this? Someone who can help you? Isabella shook her head. The only family she'd had was her mother, dead 2 years now. David's relatives were either distant or under Margaret's influence. Her few friends from before had gradually disappeared during her marriage, discouraged by Margaret's subtle hostility whenever they visited. No, she said simply. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the truck's engine working hard through the deeper snow. Isabella watched the landscape slide past endless white fields broken by dark lines of fence posts and the occasional cluster of buildings. It was beautiful in the stark way that winter could be, but she'd never look at snow the same way again. Name's Jake Morrison, the man said eventually. Been living out here for about 15 years now. Don't get many visitors, especially in weather like this. Isabella Martinez, she replied, then added, This is Sophie. Jake nodded. What brought you out to that old silo, Isabella? If you don't mind me asking. Isabella considered her options. She could lie, make up some story about getting lost in the storm. She could tell him part of the truth, but leave out the worst details. Or she could trust this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save them. This man whose first concern had been their welfare rather than his own convenience. My mother-in-law, she said quietly. We had a disagreement. She left us. There, Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't press for details. Some people got ice where their hearts should be, he said. Especially when it comes to family. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with that particular kind of cruelty. Isabella found herself studying his profile as he drove the set of his shoulders, the careful way he maintained distance, even while offering help. This was a man who understood betrayal, who had learned to be cautious about trusting others. They turned down a narrow lane marked by a weathered mailbox and 2 towering pine trees. Jake's house appeared through the trees, a modest log cabin with smoke rising from a stone chimney. It looked solid and welcoming, like something from a storybook illustration of home. Jake parked as close to the front door as possible, then came around to help Isabella out of the truck. Her legs were stronger now, warmed by the truck's heater, but she still needed support to walk through the snow to the porch. Inside, the cabin was everything the exterior had promised. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling cheerfully behind a wrought iron screen. The furniture was simple but comfortable: worn leather chairs, handmade wooden tables, shelves lined with books and local pottery. Everything spoke of a life lived deliberately, without pretense or waste. Jake settled Isabella in a chair close to the fire and disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen. She could hear him moving around, the sound of running water and cabinet doors opening and closing. When he returned, he carried a steaming mug and a plate of what looked like homemade bread. Soup's heating up, he said, setting the food on a small table beside her chair. Should be ready in a few minutes. Meanwhile, try to get some of this into your system. The bread was dense and hearty, spread with butter and honey. Isabella had to force herself to eat slowly, knowing that her empty stomach wouldn't handle too much food too quickly. But each bite sent new strength through her body, warming her from the inside out. Sophie stirred in her arms, making the first sounds Isabella had heard from her since they'd been rescued. Not crying exactly, but the small fussing noises that meant she was becoming more aware of her surroundings. "She's waking up," Isabella said, relief evident in her voice. Jake looked over from where he was tending the fire. "That's a good sign. Baby that young, hypothermia can be dangerous fast, but kids are tougher than we think sometimes." As if summoned by their conversation, Sophie's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, like Isabella's, but shaped like David's. For a moment, she looked around with the unfocused gaze of a baby trying to make sense of new surroundings. Then her gaze found Isabella's face, and she made a small sound that might have been recognition. Isabella felt tears spilling down her cheeks, tears of relief, of gratitude, of amazement that they had survived. "Hi, baby girl," she whispered. "We're okay, we're safe now." Jake watched the reunion with a careful expression, maintaining his distance, but clearly affected by what he was witnessing. When Sophie began making the rooting motions that indicated hunger, he quietly disappeared again, returning with a clean towel and a glass of water. "For you," he said, setting the water within Isabella's reach. "Important to stay hydrated if you're nursing." His matter-of-fact consideration touched Isabella more than dramatic gestures would have. Here was a man who understood practical care, who knew what was needed without being asked. She found herself wondering about his story, about what had brought him to this isolated place and taught him such quiet competence. Sophie latched on eagerly, her small hands kneading against Isabella's chest with renewed strength. The familiar rhythm of nursing was soothing to them both, a return to normalcy after hours of terror and uncertainty. "Better?" Jake asked, watching from across the room. "Much better," Isabella said. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you." Jake shook his head. "No repayment needed. Just glad I decided to check the back roads this morning. Usually don't get out that way unless there's a reason." "What made you go today?" "Heard the storm was pretty bad in that direction. Sometimes folks get stranded, need help digging out." He paused, feeding another log to the fire. "Plus I saw tire tracks heading toward the old Hartwell place yesterday evening. Didn't look like the kind of vehicle that should be driving around in a blizzard." Isabella's blood chilled at the mention of Margaret's name. "The Hartwell place? You know it? Old farmhouse about a mile from where I found you. Been empty since the owner moved to town last year." Jake looked at her curiously. Margaret Hartwell used to run that place. Tough old bird, not known for her neighborliness. Isabella realized that Jake had no idea about her connection to Margaret, didn't know that the tough old bird was the same person who had left her and Sophie to die. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, but she wasn't ready to share it yet. The rescue was too fresh, her trust too fragile. "I've heard the name," she said carefully. Jake nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. "Well, whoever was driving around there yesterday picked a hell of a time for it. Roads barely passable even now." The implications of his words weren't lost on Isabella. Margaret had driven to the silo during the storm, in dangerous conditions, specifically to trap them there. It hadn't been a moment of anger or poor judgment. It had been calculated, planned, intended to ensure they wouldn't survive the night. But they survived. Against all odds, in spite of Margaret's cruelty, they were alive and safe and growing stronger by the moment. Sophie was nursing contentedly, her color returning to normal. Isabella's body was warming, her muscles relaxing for the first time. In hours, they had survived, and now they had to figure out how to live. 3 days passed before Isabella felt strong enough to stand without Jake's steadying hand. 3 days of sleeping on his couch wrapped in quilts that smelled like cedar and wood smoke, of eating soup and homemade bread that slowly brought feeling back to her extremities, of watching Sophie grow more alert and responsive with each passing. Jake moved through his daily routines with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, but he adapted seamlessly to having guests. He never asked how long they planned to stay, never made Isabella feel like an imposition, never lingered too long when helping her navigate the awkward necessities of recovery. On the morning of the 4th day, Isabella woke to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee, studying something spread across the worn wooden surface. Maps, she realized as her vision cleared. Detailed topographical maps of the surrounding area, marked with pencil notations and colored. "Pins, morning," he said without looking up. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Isabella shifted Sophie to one arm and poured herself a cup, inhaling the rich aroma that had become one of her favorite parts of these quiet mornings. "What are you working on?" Jake glanced up, and she caught something guarded in his expression. Before he answered, "Property lines mostly. Been having some boundary disputes with neighbors lately." He gathered the maps quickly, rolling them up and securing them with a rubber band. The casual way he did, it didn't quite hide the fact that he didn't want her seeing whatever he'd been studying so intently. Isabella felt a familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach. She'd learned to read the signs of men keeping secrets, of information being withheld for her own good. David had done it near the end, hiding the extent of their financial problems because he didn't want to worry her while she was pregnant. Margaret had done it constantly, speaking in hushed tones on the phone about situations that needed handling. "Boundary disputes?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "Nothing serious," Jake said, but the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise, just neighbor stuff. "You know how it is in small communities." Isabella didn't know, actually. She'd grown up in suburbs where neighbors were polite strangers, and her adult life had been spent in David's world where Margaret controlled most social interactions. But she nodded anyway, recognizing the signal that this particular conversation was over. Jake stood and moved to the window that faced his driveway, his posture alert in a way that made Isabella's pulse quicken. "Expecting someone?" she asked. "Not exactly." His jaw was tight as he watched something she couldn't see from her position at the table. "But we might have company soon." As if summoned by his words, Isabella heard the sound of tires on gravel, an engine approaching at a speed that suggested urgency rather than casual visitation. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward a rifle mounted above the back door, though he didn't touch it. "Who is it?" Isabella asked, clutching Sophie closer. Jake didn't answer immediately. He was studying the approaching vehicle with the focused attention of someone calculating distances and response times. Finally, he spoke without turning away from the window. "Sheriff's Department." Isabella's blood turned to ice. Margaret had found them. Somehow she'd tracked them down and was using her legal threats to force their return. Isabella looked around wildly, calculating whether she had time to run, whether there was a back exit, whether Jake would try to stop her if she bolted. "Isabella." Jake's voice was calm but firm. "Sit down, let me handle this." "You don't understand," Isabella said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay composed. "She has papers, legal documents. She's going to take Sophie." Jake turned from the window then, his gray eyes steady on her face. "No one's taking that baby anywhere. I promise you that." The authority in his voice was surprising, the kind of confidence that came from experience rather than bravado. Isabella found herself sitting back down despite her panic. Sophie's fussing the only sound in the suddenly quiet kitchen. 2 sharp knocks echoed from the front door. Jake straightened his shirt and ran a hand through his hair before walking to answer it, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Isabella strained to hear the conversation from her position in the kitchen. "Morning, Sheriff Valdez." Jake's voice carried clearly through the cabin. "Jake," the sheriff's voice was professional but not unfriendly. "Sorry to bother you this early, but I got a call about missing persons. Woman and a baby might be in the area." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Margaret had reported them missing, probably with some story about Isabella's mental state and the danger she posed to Sophie. Any moment now, the sheriff would walk into the kitchen and see them, and the fragile safety Jake had provided would crumble. "Missing persons?" Jake's tone was carefully neutral. "Anyone I'd know? Isabella Martinez and her infant daughter. Last seen 3 days ago in the vicinity of the old Hartwell property. You know anything about that?" There was a pause that stretched long enough for Isabella to count her own heartbeats. Then Jake spoke again, his voice unchanged. "Can't say that. I do, but I found something interesting out that way yesterday that might be related." Isabella frowned. What was he talking about? They'd been at his cabin for 3 days, not discovered yesterday. "Found evidence someone had been trapping people in that old grain silo," Jake continued. "Heavy equipment positioned to block the door from outside. Looked deliberate." Sheriff Valdez's voice sharpened with interest. "Trapping people, you report this?" "Was planning to come in today, actually. Figured it warranted investigation. Mind if I take a look?" "Course not. I can drive you out there if you want. Roads are still pretty rough." Isabella listened to their voices fade as they moved toward Jake's truck, her mind racing to understand what had just happened. Jake had misdirected the sheriff without lying outright, bought them time while simultaneously putting Margaret's actions under official scrutiny. But why? Why would he risk his own reputation and relationship with local law enforcement to protect strangers? What did he gain from harboring them? The sound of truck doors slamming and an engine starting indicated that Jake and the sheriff were heading out to examine the silo. Isabella was alone in the cabin for the first time since her rescue, and the silence felt oppressive after days of Jake's steady presence. Sophie began crying, the sharp wail that meant she was hungry and impatient. Isabella settled into the comfortable chair by the fireplace to nurse her, but her mind kept spinning with questions and fears. What would the sheriff find at the silo? Would Margaret's story hold up under scrutiny? What would happen when Jake returned? An hour passed before she heard the truck returning. Isabella had moved to the kitchen window and watched Jake and Sheriff Valdez climb out of the vehicle, their body language serious but not adversarial. They spoke for several minutes on the driveway, the sheriff taking notes while Jake pointed in various directions and gestured toward his own property. Finally, the sheriff got into his patrol car and drove away. Jake stood watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend, then walked slowly back to the cabin. His expression was unreadable when he came through the door. "Well?" Isabella asked, unable to keep the anxiety out of her voice. Jake poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Found some interesting things at that silo, including fresh tire tracks that match a vehicle registered to Margaret Hartwell." Isabella's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "Means the sheriff's got questions about what Mrs. Hartwell was doing out there during a blizzard. Especially since she reported you missing but didn't mention she'd been to the place where you were last seen." "She have an explanation," Isabella said bitterly. "She always does," Jake nodded. "Maybe, but physical evidence is harder to explain away than stories. And there's something else." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object, setting it on the table between them. Isabella gasped when she recognized it, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, the one Margaret had claimed was lost during the move to the spare room. "Found this caught on one of the metal barriers," Jake said. "Valdez took photos before I retrieved it. Chains broken like it was torn off during a struggle." Isabella picked up the locket with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal the tiny photos inside her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and unaware of the tragedies that would follow. She'd worn it every day until Margaret had made it disappear. "She took this from me," Isabella whispered. "Said I must have misplaced it. Figured as much." Valdez is starting to put together a timeline that doesn't match Mrs. Hartwell's version of events. What happens now? Jake was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Now we wait. See what other questions come up during the investigation. And you decide what you want to do next." The weight of that decision pressed down on Isabella's shoulders. For days she'd been focused solely on survival, on keeping Sophie alive, and recovering her own strength. She hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the immediate safety of Jake's cabin, but she couldn't stay here indefinitely. Jake had his own life, his own problems, those boundary disputes he'd been studying. Whatever brought that watchful tension to his shoulders when vehicles approached. She was grateful beyond words for his help, but she couldn't burden him with their ongoing drama. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Find somewhere else to go before Margaret figures out where we are." "Where would you go?" The simple question highlighted the impossible nature of her situation. She had no family, no close friends, no resources beyond the $47 Margaret had mocked her for saving. David's life insurance had gone entirely to paying off medical bills and funeral expenses, leaving her with nothing but debt and the clothes on her back. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe find a women's shelter in a different county. Get a job somewhere Margaret can't track us down." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with those steady gray eyes. "What if you didn't have to run?" "What do you mean? What if there was another option? Something that kept you and Sophie safe without forcing you to start over with nothing in a strange place?" Isabella felt a flutter of hope mixed with wariness. In her experience, offers of help always came with hidden costs, expectations that weren't revealed until it was too late to back out gracefully. "I'm listening," she said carefully. Jake stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the plaza. Snow-covered fields that stretched toward the tree line. "This place is bigger than it looks. Main house plus a smaller cabin about a quarter-mile through those trees. Built it for my brother originally, the four." He paused, some old pain flickering across his features, before things went sideways. "Jake, I can't accept charity. I don't have any way to pay rent or—" "Not charity," he interrupted, turning back to face her. "Partnership. I need help managing this property, and you need a safe place to raise your daughter. Could be mutually beneficial." Isabella searched his face for signs of the manipulation she'd learned to recognize, the subtle pressure that meant someone wanted something from her. But Jake's expression was straightforward, almost businesslike in its simplicity. "What kind of help?" she asked. "Property management, bookkeeping, someone to handle the business side while I focus on the physical work." He gestured toward a desk in the corner where papers were stacked in haphazard piles. "I'm good with my hands, terrible with paperwork. Always behind on correspondence, invoicing, tax stuff. I don't know anything about farming. Not farming exactly. More like land management. Wildlife conservation, some timber harvesting, equipment rental to other landowners. Legitimate businesses that keep the property self-sustaining." There was something in the way he said legitimate that suggested other, less legitimate possibilities, but Isabella decided not to probe. Everyone had secrets, and Jake had already proven himself trustworthy in the ways that mattered most. "The cabin you mentioned, is it livable?" "Needs some work, but nothing major. Good bones, solid foundation. Biggest problem is it's been empty for a couple years." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Would give you privacy, independence. Sophie could have her own room." The offer was almost too good to be true, which made Isabella suspicious. Men didn't usually make generous proposals without expecting something in return, something they didn't mention up front. "What do you get out of this arrangement?" she asked bluntly. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella saw some internal struggle play out across his features. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone revealing a truth he rarely shared. "Company, I guess. Someone to talk to who isn't trying to sell me something or serve me papers. Someone who understands that sometimes life kicks you in the teeth for no good reason." The honesty in his voice was disarming. Isabella found herself believing him, not because the offer made complete sense, but because the pain underlying his words felt genuine. "What happened to your brother?" she asked softly. Jake's jaw tightened. "Overdose. 3 years ago. Built that cabin thinking I could help him get clean, give him a place to start over." He shrugged. "Turns out you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Isabella understood the weight of that kind of failure, the guilt that came from not being able to protect someone you loved. She'd felt it after David's accident, wondering if she could have convinced him to take a safer job, to prioritize his own well-being over their financial security. "I'm sorry," she said. "Ancient history now. Point is, that cabin's going to waste when it could be helping someone who actually wants a second chance." Sophie stirred in Isabella's arms, making the small sounds that indicated she was waking up. From her nap, Isabella looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt the weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders. Every decision she made would affect Sophie's future, her safety, her chances for a normal life. Running meant uncertainty, constant fear, always looking over their shoulders for Margaret's next move. Staying meant accepting help from a man she barely knew, trusting someone who had his own complicated past and mysterious present. But Jake had already saved their lives once. He'd protected them from the sheriff's questions, given them time to heal and plan their next move. If he meant them harm, he had plenty of opportunities to act on it. "I'd want to see the cabin first," Isabella said. "Make sure it's suitable for Sophie." Jake nodded. "Course. We can walk over there this afternoon if you're feeling up to it. And we'd need to discuss terms. Responsibilities, boundaries, what happens if this arrangement doesn't work out?" "Absolutely. I believe in clear expectations." Isabella took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to make a leap that would change everything. "Okay, let's talk." The cabin through the trees exceeded Isabella's modest expectations. Built from the same sturdy logs as Jake's main house, it sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that would provide privacy and protection from harsh winds. The front porch faced east, perfect for morning coffee and watching Sophie play when she got older. Inside, sunlight streamed through windows that Jake had obviously cleaned in preparation for their visit. The main room featured a stone fireplace smaller than the one in his house, but adequate for heating the space. A compact kitchen occupied one corner, equipped with appliances that looked recently serviced. 2 bedrooms branched off the main area one. That would be perfect for Isabella, and a smaller one with built-in shelves that could easily accommodate a crib and changing station. "Previous tenant left some furniture," Jake said, gesturing toward a sturdy oak table and matching chairs. "Nothing fancy, but functional." Isabella ran her hand along the table's polished surface, imagining meals shared here, homework assignments spread across its width when Sophie started school. The fantasy felt dangerous in its appeal. She'd learned not to want things too much, not to invest hope in situations that could disappear without warning. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "But Jake, I need to be clear about something. I can't pay market rent, probably not for months. Told you, this isn't about rent, it's about partnership." Jake moved to the kitchen window, checking the seal around the frame. "Property generates income, but managing it takes time I don't have. You help with the business side, I maintain the physical infrastructure. Everybody benefits." "What exactly does the business side involve?" Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "Current clients and contracts. Nothing complicated, but it needs organization." Isabella scanned the list, recognizing several names from her time living with Margaret. Local farmers, small business owners, a few government agencies. The services ranged from equipment rental to habitat restoration to something called boundary maintenance that wasn't clearly defined. Boundary maintenance? She asked. Survey work mostly. Property lines, easement disputes, that kind of thing. Jake's answer came quickly, but Isabella caught the slight tension in his voice that suggested there was more to it. She decided not to push for details. Everyone was entitled to privacy about their work, and Jake had already been more generous than she had any right to expect. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready. No rush. Important thing is Sophie's health and your recovery." They walked back to the main house in comfortable silence, Sophie sleeping peacefully in the carrier Jake had found for her. Isabella was mentally calculating logistics, what supplies they'd need, how to arrange the cabin for safety with a baby. Whether she was making a smart decision or just delaying the inevitable, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted her planning. Not one car this time, but several, their engines creating a discordant symphony that spoke of urgent purpose rather than casual visitation. Jake's entire demeanor shifted instantly. His stride lengthened, his hand moving reflexively toward the small of his back, where Isabella now noticed he carried a concealed pistol. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Take Sophie to the back bedroom and stay there until I come get you." "What's happening?" "Don't know yet. But that's too many cars for a social call." Isabella hurried inside as instructed, her heart racing with familiar panic. Through the bedroom window, she could see 3 vehicles pulling into Jake's driveway, Sheriff Valdez's patrol car, followed by a black sedan she didn't recognize, and Margaret's silver Lincoln bringing up the rear. Margaret had found them, somehow. Despite Jake's careful misdirection and the ongoing investigation, she'd tracked them down. Isabella clutched Sophie closer, her mind spinning through impossible escape scenarios. The bedroom window was too small to climb through with a baby. The back door led to open fields where they'd be visible for miles. She heard car doors slamming, multiple sets of footsteps approaching the front porch. Then Jake's voice, steady and controlled despite the circumstances. "Sheriff, Mrs. Hartwell, what can I do for you?" "Jake Morrison?" The unfamiliar voice belonged to a woman, professionally crisp. "I'm Detective Sarah Chun, County Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you about Isabella Martinez and her infant daughter." Isabella's blood turned to ice. Child Protective Services. Margaret had escalated beyond custody threats. She was now claiming Isabella was an unfit mother who posed a danger to her own child. "Don't know anyone by that name," Jake replied, his tone unchanged. "Already told Sheriff Valdez I haven't seen any missing persons." "Mr. Morrison," Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, "I know they're here. My daughter-in-law is emotionally unstable, possibly dangerous. That baby needs proper care." "Ma'am, I think you're mistaken about. I've been watching this property for 2 days," Margaret interrupted. "I know what I've seen." Isabella felt her world tilting. Margaret had been watching them, probably documenting their activities, building a case for Sophie's removal. How long before she'd gathered enough evidence to convince the authorities? "Mrs. Hartwell," Detective Chun's voice carried a note of warning. "We discussed this. You cannot conduct surveillance on private property without permission." "I was on public roads," Margaret snapped. "Last I checked, that was still legal. That's enough." Jake's voice cut through their argument with quiet authority. "You're all standing on my property, making accusations without evidence. I'm gonna need to see some warrants." "We're not here to search," Sheriff Valdez interjected diplomatically. "Just following up on a missing persons report. If you haven't seen anything, that's fine. But Mrs. Hartwell seems pretty convinced. Mrs. Hartwell seems pretty convinced of a lot of things." Jake said, and Isabella could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. Doesn't make them true. What's that supposed to mean? Margaret's voice rose sharply. Means maybe we should talk about what really happened at that grain silo. About why you were driving around in a blizzard. About how that young woman's jewelry ended up caught on barriers that someone used to trap people inside. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella could picture Margaret's face, the way her expression would shift from righteous anger to calculation as she processed this new information. I don't know what you're implying, Margaret said finally, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Not implying anything, Jake replied, just stating facts. Facts that don't seem to match your story about being worried about your daughter-in-law's welfare. Detective Chun spoke up, her tone sharper now. Mr. Morrison, if you have information relevant to this case, you need to share it with us directly. Happy to. Soon as you explain why you're taking the word of someone who might be involved in attempted murder. The accusation hung in the air, like a gunshot echo. Isabella heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath, the shuffle of feet as people repositioned themselves. That's a serious allegation, Sheriff Valdez said carefully. It's a ridiculous allegation, Margaret shot back, but Isabella could hear the strain in her voice. I would never hurt that baby. She's my son's daughter. Is she? Jake's question was quietly devastating. Because according to you, there's some question about paternity. Hard to claim grandmother's rights to a child you say isn't your son's. Isabella realized with growing amazement that Jake had been listening more carefully than she'd known, picking up details from her carefully, edited explanations, and building a strategy around Margaret's own contradictions. The paternity question is exactly why that child needs proper care, Margaret said, rallying. Isabella is clearly unstable. She abandoned her responsibilities, put that baby at risk. She didn't abandon anything, Jake interrupted, his voice cutting through Margaret's protests. She was abandoned, left to die in a freezing silo with a 3-month-old baby. You can't prove that, can't I? Physical evidence says otherwise. Tire tracks that match your vehicle. Barriers positioned from the outside. Personal items torn off during a struggle. Jake paused for effect. Want to explain to Detective Chun how all that happened if you were just worried about their safety? Isabella heard movement outside, hushed. Conversation between the detective and sheriff that she couldn't quite make out. When Detective Chun spoke again, her tone had shifted noticeably. Mrs. Hartwell, I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your allegations. Sheriff Valdez, can you escort Mrs. Hartwell to the station? I'd like to interview her. Separately. This is ridiculous, Margaret protested. I'm the victim here. I'm trying to protect my granddaughter from an unfit mother. Ma'am, if you'll just cooperate with the investigation. Investigation? Margaret's voice rose to near hysteria. You should be investigating her. She's probably inside right now, filling that baby's head with lies about me, poisoning her against her own family. Mrs. Hartwell. Detective Chun's voice carried unmistakable authority now. You need to calm down and accompany Sheriff Valdez. We'll sort this out at the station. Isabella heard the sound of footsteps moving away from the house, car doors slamming with more force than necessary. 2 engines started and pulled away, leaving only one vehicle in the driveway. After several minutes, Jake's voice called softly through the house. Isabella, you can come out now. She emerged from the bedroom cautiously, still carrying Sophie, to find Jake standing in the living room with Detective Chun. The detective was younger than Isabella had expected, probably early 30s, with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen enough family drama to recognize the real story when she heard it. Ms. Martinez, Detective Chun said gently. I'm Sarah Chun with County Child Services. I'd like to ask you some questions about your recent experiences. Isabella's first instinct was to run, to grab Sophie and disappear into the woods rather than submit to another round of interrogation. But Jake's steady presence beside her, the detective's non-threatening posture, gave her courage to stay. "Am I in trouble?" Isabella asked. "Not at all. But I need to understand what's been happening with your living situation, your relationship with Mrs. Hartwell, and the circumstances that brought you here." Isabella looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "It's okay," he said. "Tell her what happened." For the next hour, Isabella found herself recounting the entire nightmare, David's death, Margaret's growing hostility, the hair-cutting and abandonment, the night in the silo. Detective Chen listened without interruption, taking careful notes, and asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the dynamics at play. "Mrs. Hartwell claims you're an unfit mother," Detective Chen said finally. "That you've been neglecting Sophie's medical care and living in unsafe conditions." "That's not true," Isabella said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Sophie sees Dr. Patterson for regular checkups. She's gained weight appropriately, met all her developmental milestones. I have her medical records if you need them." "What about your living situation?" "Mrs. Hartwell says you've been transient, moving from place to place." Isabella hesitated, unsure how to explain her arrangement with Jake without making it sound temporary or inappropriate. Jake stepped in smoothly. "Isabella and Sophie are staying in my guest cabin while we work out a business partnership," he said. "She's helping me manage property contracts and administrative work. It's a legitimate arrangement that benefits both of us." Detective Chun made another note. "And you're comfortable with this arrangement, Ms. Martinez? No one is pressuring you to stay here against your will?" "No," Isabella said firmly. "Jake saved our lives. He's given us a safe place to live while I get back on my feet." The detective studied them both for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in details Isabella couldn't even guess at. Finally, she closed her notebook and stood. "Based on what I've observed today, I see no evidence of neglect or unsafe conditions," she said. "Sophie appears healthy and well cared for, and you seem to have a stable support system here." Isabella felt tears of relief beginning to form. What about Margaret's claims? The custody threats? Mrs. Hartwell's credibility has been significantly undermined by today's revelations, Detective Chain said carefully. "The physical evidence Mr. Morrison described suggests criminal behavior rather than legitimate concern for child welfare. The sheriff's department will be conducting a full investigation." "And Sophie? Can Margaret still try to take her?" "Custody challenges require legal standing. As a grandmother, Mrs. Hartwell would need to prove either that you're unfit or that she has some pre-existing legal relationship with the child. Given today's circumstances, I doubt any judge would entertain her claims." Isabella felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Sophie was safe. They were safe. Detective Chun handed Isabella a business card. "If Mrs. Hartwell contacts you directly or tries to interfere with your custody again, call me immediately. Document everything: dates, times, witnesses. The investigation will take time, but I don't think you'll have further problems with her claims." After the detective left, Isabella and Jake stood in the sudden quiet of his living room, the weight of what had just happened settling over them both. Sophie gurgled contentedly from her carrier, oblivious to the drama that had swirled around her. "Thank you," Isabella said quietly, "for everything. I don't know how you knew exactly what to say, but Margaret's type isn't hard to figure out." Jake said, "Bullies always overplay their hand eventually. Give them enough rope, and they hang themselves." Isabella looked at this man who had saved them twice now, first from the silo, then from Margaret's legal machinations, and felt something shift inside her. Not just gratitude, though that was overwhelming. Something deeper, warmer, more complicated. "The cabin," she said suddenly. "If the offer is still open, I'd like to accept." Jake's smile was small but genuine. "It's open. For as long as you want it." Isabella nodded, feeling like she was finally truly safe for the first time since David's death. Sophie was protected. Margaret's threats had been neutralized, and they had a home, a real home, where they could build a new life. The confrontation was over. Now the real work could begin. Moving into the cabin felt like stepping into a life that actually belonged to her. For the first time since David's death, Isabella woke up in a space where she made the decisions. What time to get up, what to have for breakfast, how to arrange the furniture. Small freedoms that most people took for granted felt revolutionary. After months of living under Margaret's controlling scrutiny, Jake had surprised her with practical gifts that spoke to genuine understanding rather than obligation. A high chair for Sophie, positioned perfectly by the kitchen window where Isabella could watch the woods while feeding her daughter. A rocking chair for the baby's room, handcrafted from pine and smooth as silk under her palms. Most touchingly, a security system with panic buttons in each room that connected directly to his house. "Just in case," he'd said when installing the final sensor. "Probably overkill, but peace of mind's worth the extra wiring." Isabella had tested the system once, just to hear his voice crackling through the intercom, reassuring and immediate. The knowledge that help was literally a button press away allowed her to sleep deeply for the first time in months. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Isabella discovered that Jake's business side was more complex than she'd initially understood. The filing cabinets in his office revealed contracts with state environmental agencies, correspondence with federal wildlife departments, and invoicing for services that seemed to require specialized knowledge of land management law. "You're basically running a conservation consulting firm," she told him over coffee one morning, spreading the organized files across his kitchen table. "Why didn't you just say that?" Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with her obvious admiration. "Sounds fancier than it is. Mostly I just know how to read survey maps and tell when someone's cutting corners on environmental protection. These invoices suggest you're saving the state thousands of dollars by catching permit violations before they become legal disasters." Isabella pointed to a thick file labeled Wetland Restoration, Miller Creek. "This is important work." "Work? That was drowning in paperwork before you showed up," Jake replied. "I'm 3 months behind on progress reports and haven't sent out invoices in 6 weeks. Isabella had already noticed that problem and had spent the previous evening creating a digital filing system that would streamline his reporting requirements. She'd also identified several uncollected payments that totaled more than enough to cover her and Sophie's living expenses for a year. "I can have you caught up by the end of the month," she said confidently. "But I need to understand the technical aspects better. Maybe you could show me some of the actual sites?" That afternoon, Jake drove her and Sophie to a property about 20 miles south where he was overseeing habitat restoration after illegal logging had damaged a watershed. Isabella strapped Sophie into the carrier Jake had bought for their excursions and followed him along marked trails that wound through sections of forest in various stages of recovery. "Previous owner cleared this entire hillside," Jake explained, pointing to an area where young trees were beginning to reclaim bare ground. "Destroyed stream beds, killed off wildlife corridors, violated about 6 different environmental regulations." "How did you get involved?" "State hired me to assess damage and recommend restoration strategies. Turns out I'm good at translating science into language lawyers and judges can understand." Isabella could see why. Jake's explanations were clear and detailed without being condescending, grounded in practical knowledge rather than academic theory. As they walked, she began to understand that his work wasn't just about environmental protection. It was about holding people accountable for damage they tried to hide or minimize. "Must make you popular with certain landowners," she observed. Jake's laugh was dry. "About as popular as a tax audit. But the work needs doing, and I don't mind being the bad guy when it serves a purpose." They stopped at a creek bed where Jake was monitoring water quality improvements. Sophie babbled happily from her carrier, reaching toward the sunlight filtering through new leaf growth. Isabella found herself imagining bringing her daughter here regularly, teaching her to identify bird calls and track seasonal changes. She could grow up loving places like this, Isabella said, more to herself than to Jake. Kids who grow up around conservation work usually develop good instincts about land stewardship, Jake replied. Important skill set for the future. The casual way he included Sophie in long-term planning made Isabella's chest tight with gratitude. He wasn't just offering them temporary shelter, he was envisioning a future where they belonged, where Sophie could develop roots and relationships that would last. That evening, while Sophie napped in her crib, Isabella called Dr. Patterson's office to schedule Sophie's 4-month checkup. The receptionist who answered was someone Isabella had known slightly during her marriage to David, and the conversation quickly turned personal. "I heard about the troubles with Mrs. Hartwell," the woman said in the conspiratorial tone that small towns perfected. "Terrible business, that whole situation with the silo." Isabella's stomach clenched. "What are people saying?" "Mostly Margaret lost her mind with grief and took it out on you and the baby. The sheriff's been asking questions around town about her behavior since David passed. Folks are remembering things differently now, if you know what I mean." Isabella did know. In small communities, public opinion could shift quickly once people felt safe expressing what they'd previously kept to themselves. Margaret's reputation for controlling behavior would be re-examined through the lens of attempted abandonment, and the verdict wouldn't be favorable. "How's little Sophie doing?" The receptionist continued. "I heard Jake Morrison's been helping you out. He's a good man, even if he keeps to himself mostly." "Sophie's doing well," Isabella said carefully. "And yes, Jake's been very kind." "Kind and single," the woman added with obvious hint. "Not that it's any of my business, but that man could use some happiness in his life." After hanging up, Isabella found herself thinking about the receptionist's comments. She'd been so focused on survival and immediate safety that she hadn't really considered how her arrangement with Jake might look to outsiders, or what it might develop into over time. Jake was attractive in a quiet, competent way that had grown more appealing as she'd gotten to know him. His hands were strong and gentle when he helped with Sophie, his voice patient when explaining complicated environmental concepts, his presence steadying during moments of uncertainty. But she wasn't sure she was ready to think about romance, or whether Jake's kindness came from genuine interest or simple decency. The question became more pressing the following weekend when Jake invited her to accompany him to a town meeting about proposed development in the county. "Might be good for you to meet some people," he'd suggested. "Start building connections outside of our little bubble here." Isabella's first instinct was to refuse. Public appearances meant exposure, the possibility of encountering Margaret's supporters, or people who believed her version of events. But she was tired of hiding, tired of letting fear dictate her choices. "What's the meeting about?" she asked. "Big development company wants to build a shopping complex near the state park, claiming it'll bring jobs and tax revenue, but they're glossing over environmental impact." Jake's expression hardened. "I've seen their environmental assessment. It's either incompetent or deliberately misleading. And you're going to point that out publicly?" "Someone has to. Local officials don't always have the expertise to spot problems in technical reports." Isabella admired his willingness to stand up for his principles, even when it made him unpopular. It was a quality David had possessed too, though he'd expressed it differently through his work ethic, his refusal to cut corners, even when it cost them financially. "Okay," she said, "I'll come. But I'm bringing Sophie, and if people start staring or whispering, we leave immediately," Jake finished. "No arguments, no explanations required." The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, folding chairs. arranged in neat rows facing a table where county commissioners sat with thick binders and tired expressions. Isabella recognized several faces from her time in town with David, though no one approached her directly. The attention she drew seemed more curious than hostile people trying to reconcile the confident woman beside Jake Morrison with whatever gossip they'd heard about Margaret's unstable daughter-in-law. Jake's presentation was methodical and devastating. Using maps and photographs projected onto a portable screen, he demonstrated how the proposed development would disrupt wildlife migration routes, compromise water quality in 3 different watersheds, and violate federal wetland protection standards. The developer's environmental assessment claims minimal impact, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. But their own data shows potential contamination of the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 1,200 residents. A murmur of concern rippled through the audience. Isabella watched the commissioners' faces as Jake continued his analysis, noting how their expressions shifted from polite attention to genuine alarm. "Are you saying the company lied in their report?" one commissioner asked. "I'm saying their conclusions don't match their data," Jake replied diplomatically. "Whether that's intentional misrepresentation or professional incompetence, I can't say. But the impact on this community would be the same either way." The developer's representative, a sleek man in an expensive suit, stood to object. "Mr. Morrison is known for opposing any development in this county. His so-called analysis is biased personal agenda." Isabella felt herself bristling at the dismissive tone, the attempt to undermine Jake's credibility through personal attack rather than factual rebuttal. Before she could stop herself, she was standing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "I've spent the last month reviewing Mr. Morrison's work, and I can tell you his analysis is thorough, well documented, and based on current scientific standards. If you have specific objections to his data, please present them. Otherwise, personal attacks on his character don't address the environmental concerns he's raised." The gymnasium fell silent. Isabella could feel dozens of eyes on her, probably surprised to see Margaret Hartwell's supposedly unstable daughter-in-law speaking with authority about environmental law. She remained standing, meeting the developer's representative's gaze. Steadily, Jake's voice was warm with approval when he responded. "Ms. Martinez raises a good point. I'm happy to answer specific technical questions about my methodology or findings." The developer's representative sat down without further comment, clearly unprepared for detailed technical debate. The commissioners spent another hour reviewing Jake's evidence and ultimately voted to table the development proposal pending an independent environmental review. As people filed out of the gymnasium, several approached Isabella and Jake with thanks and questions. Isabella found herself discussing water quality standards with a local farmer, explaining permit requirements to a small business owner, and fielding compliments on her excellent points from the county commissioner who'd chaired the meeting. "Didn't know you had it in you," Jake said quietly as they walked to his truck. "Didn't know either," Isabella admitted. "But watching that guy try to dismiss your work made me angry. You were right, and he was trying to win through intimidation rather than facts. Reminded me why I usually work alone," Jake said, but he was smiling. Having backup makes a difference. On the drive home, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced since before David's death: pride in her own competence. Satisfaction in work that mattered, the sense that she was contributing something valuable rather than just surviving. She'd found her voice again, and it felt stronger than before. Sophie had slept through the entire meeting, comfortable in the carrier that Jake had modified with extra padding. Now she was awake and alert, studying the landscape sliding past. The truck windows with the intense focus of a baby discovering the world. "She's going to grow up here," Isabella said, the realization hitting her with surprising force. "This is going to be home for her. That's okay with you?" Jake asked. Isabella considered the question seriously. A year ago, she would have described her ideal life very differently. A suburban house with a white picket fence, neighbors she chatted with over coffee, Sophie playing in a manicured backyard. But that life had never really existed, even when she'd thought she was living it. Margaret's control had made it an illusion, a performance of normalcy rather than genuine contentment. This was real. Jake's respect for her intelligence, the meaningful work she was learning to do, the community connections she was building on her own terms. Sophie would grow up understanding land stewardship and environmental responsibility, surrounded by adults who solved problems through knowledge and persistence rather than manipulation and control. More than okay, Isabella said. It's what I want. What we both want. Jake nodded, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel as they turned into their shared driveway. Good, he said simply, because I was hoping you'd stay. That night, after putting Sophie to bed in her own room in their own cabin, Isabella stood on her front porch and looked across the clearing toward Jake's house. Warm light glowed in his windows, and she could see his silhouette moving around the kitchen as he cleaned up after dinner. She thought about the woman who had sat in that grain silo just weeks ago, broken and desperate and convinced that she had nothing left to offer the world. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she'd been but wasn't anymore. Isabella Martinez was building a new life from scratch, and for the first time in years, she was doing it exactly the way she wanted. 6 months after that December night. In the grain silo, Isabella stood before the bathroom mirror in her cabin, running a brush through hair that now fell in soft waves past her shoulders. The ragged, humiliating cut Margaret had inflicted was completely gone, replaced by healthy growth that caught the morning light streaming through the window. Sophie's babbling from the kitchen reminded Isabella that her daughter was waiting for breakfast, probably trying to feed herself with the determination of an 8-month-old who'd recently discovered the joy of independence. Isabella smiled at the sound so different from the weak mewling that had terrified her during their night of abandonment. The kitchen scene that greeted her confirmed her suspicions. Sophie sat in her high chair, cheerfully smearing mashed banana across the tray while attempting to guide spoonfuls toward her mouth. More food decorated her face and bib than had actually been consumed, but her delighted expression made the mess worthwhile. "Good morning, troublemaker," Isabella said, kissing Sophie's sticky cheek. "Making art with your breakfast again?" Sophie responded with an enthusiastic squeal and offered Isabella a fistful of bananas, which she pretended to eat with great appreciation. These morning rituals had become precious to Isabella's simple, joyful moments that reminded her how far they'd traveled from those desperate hours when she'd wondered if Sophie would survive the night. A knock at the door interrupted their breakfast. "Game." Isabella opened it to find Jake holding a steaming travel mug and wearing the expression he got when he was trying to appear casual about something important. "Morning delivery," he said, offering her the coffee. "Figured you might need caffeine before the big day." Today marked the completion of Isabella's first major independent project, comprehensive environmental impact assessment for a proposed wind farm that could bring clean energy jobs to 3 counties. She'd spent weeks researching federal regulations, analyzing soil surveys, and coordinating with wildlife biologists to produce a report that would guide the state's decision on the project. "Nervous?" Jake asked, settling into the chair across from her while Sophie demonstrated her banana-throwing technique. "Excited, mostly," Isabella replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. "A year ago, I never would have imagined myself writing environmental policy recommendations." "A year ago, you were surviving Margaret Hartwell," Jake pointed out. "Compared to that, analyzing wind turbine placement is probably relaxing." Isabella laughed, but the mention of Margaret stirred memories she usually kept carefully buried. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 months ago with Margaret pleading guilty to reckless endangerment and child endangerment charges. She'd received probation and mandatory counseling, along with a restraining order that prohibited any contact with Isabella or Sophie. The strange thing was that Isabella felt no satisfaction in Margaret's legal troubles, only a kind of hollow sadness for a woman whose grief had twisted into something destructive. David wouldn't have wanted his mother to suffer, even after what she'd done. He would have hoped for healing, for some path toward redemption that Isabella wasn't sure Margaret would ever find. Detective Chun called yesterday, Isabella said, returning to the present. Margaret completed her court-ordered counseling program. The restraining order is still in effect, but her probation officer thinks she's genuinely working on her issues. Jake's expression remained carefully neutral. How do you feel about that? Relieved, I think. I never wanted revenge, just safety. For Sophie, Isabella wiped banana from her daughter's chin. Maybe someday she'd be ready to have a healthy relationship with her granddaughter. Maybe not. But at least Sophie will have the choice when she's old enough to make it. That's generous of you. It's practical, Isabella corrected. Holding on to anger would only hurt me and Sophie. Margaret's already taken enough of our energy. Jake nodded, understanding the wisdom in that approach. It was one of the things Isabella had come to value most about him, his ability to recognize emotional complexity without trying to simplify or fix it. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patterson for Sophie's 8-month checkup, a house call that the pediatrician had started making after learning about their remote location. Isabella appreciated not having to navigate the curious stares and whispered conversations that still occasionally followed her in town. She's thriving, Dr. Patterson announced after completing his examination. Weight gain is excellent, developmental. Milestones all on track. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. She's got good influences, Isabella said, glancing at Jake, who was currently entertaining Sophie with an impressive series of silly faces. Dr. Patterson followed her gaze and smiled. Family stability makes a huge difference in infant development. Sophie's lucky to have such a solid support system. After the doctor left, Jake lingered over his second cup of coffee, apparently in no hurry to return to his own work. Isabella recognized the signs. He had something on his mind, but wasn't sure how to bring it up. What is it? She asked directly. Jake set down his mug and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. I've been thinking about our partnership arrangement. Isabella's stomach clenched. Was he regretting their agreement? Had she overstepped somehow, assumed too much autonomy in managing his business affairs? If you're not satisfied with my work, she began. That's not it, Jake interrupted quickly. Your work is excellent. Better than excellent, you've transformed how I operate. I'm actually making money now instead of just breaking even. Then. What? Jake stood and walked to the window, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I'm wondering if maybe we should make it official. The partnership, I mean. Legal documents, shared ownership of the business, that kind of thing. Isabella stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. You want to make me a partner? Officially? 50-50 split, Jake said, turning back to face her. You're doing half the work, you should own half the business. Plus it would give you financial security, legal protection, something that's really yours. The offer was staggering in its generosity, but Isabella found herself focusing on what Jake hadn't said. Partnership papers would formalize their business relationship, but they would also make it clear that their personal relationship remained undefined. That's incredibly generous, she said carefully. But are you sure? Partnership is a big commitment. I'm sure about the business side, Jake replied. You've proven yourself 10 times over. As for the rest... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything personal because of our professional arrangement. Clean separation keeps things honest. Isabella understood what he was trying to do, protect her from feeling obligated to him romantically because of his help. It was thoughtful and ethical. But it also felt like a door closing on possibilities she'd been too cautious to fully acknowledge. "What if I don't want clean separation?" she asked quietly. Jake's expression shifted, hope and uncertainty warring in his features. "What do you mean?" Isabella stood and walked to where he was standing by the window, Sophie gurgling contentedly from her high chair behind them. "I mean, what if the partnership isn't the only thing I want to make official?" Isabella ... Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "I don't want you to think you have to." "I don't think I have to do anything," Isabella interrupted. "For the first time in years, I'm making choices because I want to, not because I'm afraid or desperate or trying to please someone else." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his morning beard under her palm. "I want to build something with you, Jake. Not just business, not just friendship, something more." Jake's hands came up to cover hers, his gray eyes searching her face. "Are you sure?" "Really sure. Because once we cross that line, I'm sure," Isabella said firmly. "I've been sure for weeks. I was just waiting to feel like I deserved happiness again. And now you do?" "Now I know I do." Jake's kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was still giving her space to change her mind. But when Isabella responded with enthusiasm that matched her words, he pulled her closer, and she felt the last walls between them dissolve. They were interrupted by Sophie's demanding squeal for attention, and they broke apart laughing, remembering that life-changing moments often happened in the middle of ordinary morning routines. "So," Jake said, his arms still around Isabella's waist, "business partnership and whatever comes after that," Isabella replied. "One step at a time, but together." That afternoon, they drove to the county courthouse to file the partnership papers, Sophie riding between them in her car seat and babbling commentary on the scenery. Isabella felt a deep satisfaction signing her name to legal documents that recognized her as an equal owner of something valuable, something she'd helped build. On the way home, they stopped at the old grain silo where Isabella's nightmare had begun. Jake had been monitoring it as part of his environmental consulting work, documenting its structural deterioration for eventual safe demolition. Isabella stood in the doorway where Jake had found her, looking at the space that had nearly become her tomb. The makeshift shelter she'd built was long gone, cleared away by investigators and weather. Only the concrete floor and rusted walls remained, silent witnesses to the worst night of her life. "I used to have nightmares about this place," Isabella sighed, bouncing Sophie gently in her arms. "But standing here now, I mostly feel grateful." "Grateful?" Jake sounded surprised. "This is where I learned I was stronger than I knew. Where I decided to fight for Sophie instead of giving up. Where you found us." Isabella turned to face him. "If Margaret hadn't left us here, we might never have met. Sophie might never have had the chance to grow up in a place where she's truly wanted." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the complex alchemy that could transform trauma into wisdom, devastation into foundation. "What do you think should happen to this place?" he asked. Isabella considered the question seriously. The silo was structurally unsound, potentially dangerous to curious children or wildlife. But it was also part of their story, the place where their family had been forged in crisis and determination. "Tear it down," she said finally, "but plant something beautiful where it stood. Wildflowers, maybe, or fruit trees. Something that gives life instead of containing it." 6 months later, on the anniversary of that December night, Isabella and Jake stood in the same spot with Sophie, who was now taking her first wobbly steps across the meadow where the silo had once loomed. Native wildflowers carpeted the ground in brilliant colors: purple lupin, golden black-eyed Susans, white Queen Anne's lace dancing in the summer breeze. Sophie laughed as she stumbled toward a butterfly that had landed nearby, her chubby hands reaching for beauty that stayed just beyond her grasp. She was wearing a white sundress that Isabella had sewn herself, her dark hair caught in tiny pigtails that bounced with each determined step. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," Jake said, his wedding ring catching the sunlight as he reached for Isabella's hand. Their marriage, 3 months ago, had been a small ceremony in the backyard of their shared property, witnessed by friends from the environmental community and neighbors who had become family. Sophie had served as flower girl, toddling down the aisle and dropping rose petals with the serious concentration of someone performing an important job. Isabella looked at her daughter, now confidently exploring a world where she was cherished and protected, where her curiosity was encouraged and her laughter was the soundtrack to daily life. She thought about the promise she'd made in that freezing silo to fight for Sophie until her last breath. She'd kept that promise, but the fight had transformed into something unexpected. Instead of battling against cruelty and abandonment, she'd fought for love and partnership and the radical idea that she deserved both. Instead of struggling alone against impossible odds, she'd found someone who understood that true strength meant building something together. "No," Isabella said, squeezing Jake's hand as Sophie discovered a patch of clover and sat down to examine it closely. "It feels like the beginning." A meadow stretched out before them, alive with possibility and growth, marked only by the beauty they'd chosen to plant where destruction once stood. Sophie's laughter carried on the wind, a sound that spoke of safety and joy and futures built on foundations of love rather than fear. In the distance, their home waited, 2 cabins connected by shared purpose and daily devotion, a business that protected the land they loved, a life that honored both independence and partnership. It wasn't the life Isabella had once imagined for herself, but it was infinitely better. She had learned that sometimes the worst things that happened to you were also the things that led you to where you truly belonged. Sometimes love didn't knock at the door. Sometimes it pulled you from the wreckage and offered you the chance to build something entirely new. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, you found the courage to say yes. 3 years had passed since that transformative night, and Isabella Morrison stood at the podium of the State Environmental Conference, looking out at an audience of scientists, policymakers, and conservation professionals. Her presentation on community-based habitat restoration had drawn the largest crowd of the day, standing room only in the convention center's main auditorium. "Effective environmental protection requires more than scientific data," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "It requires communities that understand their connection to the land and feel empowered to protect it." In the front row, Jake sat with Sophie on his lap, the 4-year-old coloring quietly in a notebook while occasionally looking up to wave at her mother. Sophie had grown into a confident, curious child who could identify bird species and knew the difference between native and invasive plants. Her questions about why some places were healthy and others weren't had inspired Isabella to develop educational programs that made environmental science accessible to families. The Morrison Land Trust has developed partnerships with 12 schools in rural counties, Isabella continued, clicking to the next slide showing children planting native seedlings. Students learn conservation principles through hands-on restoration projects, creating the next generation of environmental stewards. The Morrison Land Trust, their shared vision made official, now manages over 2,000 acres of protected habitat while providing environmental consulting services across 3 states. Isabella had discovered she had a gift for translating complex ecological concepts into practical action plans that communities could implement and sustain. After her presentation, Isabella was approached by Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Colorado, who had been following their work through published research papers. "Your community engagement model is exactly what we need to scale conservation efforts nationwide," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Have you considered developing a formal training program? We'd love to discuss a university partnership." Isabella felt the familiar thrill of professional recognition. but also the grounding awareness that her success was built on partnership rather than individual achievement. "I'd need to discuss it with my business partner," she said. "All major decisions are collaborative. Your husband?" "My husband," Isabella confirmed with a smile, "who also happens to be the best field researcher I've ever worked with." That evening, they celebrated at the conference hotel restaurant, Sophie charming the waitstaff with her enthusiasm for the children's menu and her detailed explanation of why fish needed clean water to survive. Isabella watched her daughter's animated conversation with Jake about the day's presentations and felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with professional accolades. "University partnership could be big," Jake said once Sophie was distracted. "By dessert. Legitimize what we're doing on a completely different scale." "It would mean travel, probably some relocation eventually," Isabella pointed out. "Graduate students, research deadlines, academic politics. You interested in that world?" Isabella considered the question honestly. 3 years ago she would have been intimidated by the prospect of working with university researchers, convinced she lacked the credentials for serious academic collaboration. Now she understood that her practical experience and community connections were exactly what environmental science needed. "I think I am," she said, "but only if we can maintain what we've built. The land, the community relationships, Sophie's stability. Everything's negotiable," Jake replied. "No opportunity is worth losing what matters most." The next morning, they drove home through mountain passes where autumn was painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. Sophie fell asleep in her car seat, her small hand clutching a stuffed owl that Jake had bought her at the conference gift shop. As they turned into their driveway, Isabella noticed a car she didn't recognize parked near Jake's workshop. A middle-aged woman emerged from the vehicle as they pulled up, her posture nervous but determined. Isabella's blood chilled as recognition hit her. Margaret Hartwell looked older, thinner, her gray hair shorter and her clothes simpler than Isabella remembered. But the eyes were unmistakable, though they held an expression Isabella had never seen before, something that might have been humility. Jake's hand found Isabella's instinctively. "Want me to handle this?" "No," Isabella said, surprising herself. With her calm tone, "I've got it." She got out of the truck slowly, positioning herself between Margaret and the vehicle where Sophie still slept. Jake followed, his presence supportive but not interfering, trusting Isabella to set the boundaries. "Mrs. Hartwell," Isabella said evenly, "you're violating the restraining order." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I needed to see. I needed to know she was all right." "Who? Sophie?" Margaret nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "My counselor says I need to make amends for the harm I caused. Not for my benefit, but for yours. To acknowledge what I did and take responsibility." Isabella studied the woman who had once terrorized her, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But Margaret's distress seemed genuine, her vulnerability real rather than performed. "Say what you came to say," Isabella said. Margaret took a shaky breath. "I tried to kill you and my granddaughter because I couldn't bear that. You represented David's happiness without me. I was so consumed by grief and jealousy that I convinced myself you were the problem, not my own inability to let go." The raw honesty of the admission caught Isabella off guard. She'd expected excuses, justifications, attempts to minimize the severity of what had happened. "I don't expect forgiveness," Margaret continued. "I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did, that I take full responsibility. And seeing you here, seeing that you survived and built something beautiful despite what I did to you, it gives me hope that healing is possible." Isabella felt Jake's hand on her shoulder, a gentle reminder that she didn't have to respond immediately, didn't owe Margaret anything. "I forgave you a long time ago," Isabella said finally. "Not for your sake, but for mine and Sophie's." Carrying anger wasn't serving us. Margaret's face crumpled. She's beautiful, Sophie. I saw her sleeping in the car. She looks so much like David did at that age. She is beautiful, Isabella agreed. And she's loved. Completely, unconditionally loved. I know, I can see that. Margaret wiped her eyes with the tissue. I won't contact you again. I just needed to apologize in person, to acknowledge what I took from you and what you built despite my best efforts to destroy it. As Margaret got back into her car, Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, not reconciliation exactly, but a kind of completion. The circle of trauma had been closed not through revenge or punishment, but through the radical act of moving forward, of building something beautiful in spite of cruelty. Sophie woke up as they were unloading the car, rubbing her eyes and asking about the stranger who had driven away. Someone who knew your daddy, Isabella said simply. Someone who needed to see that we're happy. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Isabella and Jake sat on their front porch looking out at the meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching frost. The land around them hummed with the quiet activity of creatures preparing for winter, a seasonal rhythm that had become as familiar and comforting as their own daily routines. Any regrets? Jake asked, his arm around Isabella's shoulders. About what, Margaret? Letting her see how well we're doing. Some people might say she didn't deserve that courtesy. Isabella considered the question. Maybe she didn't deserve it. But I deserve to be the kind of person who could offer it. Sophie deserves to grow up, seeing that strength means choosing kindness when you have the power to choose cruelty. Jake nodded, understanding the distinction. Think she stay away now? I think she got what she came for. Permission to stop hating herself, maybe. Proof that her worst actions didn't permanently destroy what they were meant to destroy. And if she doesn't stay away? Isabella smiled, feeling the solid weight of the life she'd built, the relationship she'd nurtured, the work that gave her purpose. Then we handle it, together, like we handle everything else. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, the same constellations that had witnessed her desperation in that grain silo and now illuminated her contentment. Sophie slept safely in her own room, dreaming whatever dreams filled the mind of a child who had never known want or fear or abandonment. The story that had begun with scissors and cruelty and winter cold had transformed into something unrecognizable: partnership and purpose, and the radical proposition that love could indeed triumph over deliberate harm. Not through magic or luck, but through the patient work of choosing healing over revenge, building over destroying, hope over despair. Isabella had learned that survival was only the beginning. The real victory lay in what you built afterward, in how you chose to use the strength that suffering had forced you to discover. She had built a life worth defending, a love worth celebrating, a future worth believing in. And in the morning, she would wake up and choose it all again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.